For over 2 decades, silence reigned where truth should have echoed. But now, Prince Edward has shattered the royal code. In a jaw-dropping revelation that sent shockwaves through the monarchy, Edward claims to know exactly who orchestrated the crash that took Princess Diana's life. He's naming names, exposing hidden documents, and unraveling the carefully crafted story the world was told. From secret meetings to buried evidence, his accusations go beyond scandal. They pierce the very heart of the royal establishment. This isn't just another royal headline. This is the reckoning the firm never saw coming. And it's only just begun. Shocking cold open. Edward speaks up. Edward appeared at the edge of his family under a gray sky, his usually composed demeanor softened by gravity. He paused, flanked by trusted aides. No cameras, no fanfare, only hushed anticipation. Then he spoke. "I have evidence, real evidence, that someone high in this palace ordered the crash that killed Diana." His voice wavered as he added, "This changes everything." Those words marked decades of hidden pain now released into the open. Edward admitted the truth had weighed on him since that tragic night, but he only now felt compelled to break his silence. The world gasped, watched, and waited, knowing a royal had just walked across a point of no return. With that fragile revelation, Edward teased deeper truths implicating Camilla and Charles directly. He spoke of documents, testimonies, and long-silenced conversations that challenged the carefully preserved narrative. The implication was crystal clear. This wasn't Scotland Yard or investigators approaching the truth. It was a prince, born into the institution, prepared to dismantle its foundation with words alone. The emotional tone had been set. This announcement wasn't calculated. This was confession. This was reckoning. And it left everyone waiting for the rest of the story. Diana's unease before Paris. In the solemn calm after his dramatic public entrance, Edward recounted private conversations with Diana in the months before Paris. He spoke of how his sister-in-law, charismatic, compassionate, yet increasingly fearful, told him she felt watched. He quietly revealed a private diary entry of hers. "I fear I'm being cornered. I sense control." Edward then shared a story of an anonymous phone call Diana received in London, a whispered warning to leave the country quietly. She had confided in him. Are they planning something? Her questions haunted Edward, but at the time, everyone brushed off her fear as anxiety rather than threat. He remembered her final plea before she left for Paris. "Don't let them silence me." Those words spun through Edward's mind now, like a warning and echoing back from the past. He wasn't sure then what she meant, or who they were. But he could no longer ignore her fear as paranoia. And as the days passed, he began to see. Perhaps Diana's sense of danger was justified. Perhaps the things dismissed as anxiety had been the early signs of something darker already in motion. Camilla's rising influence in the 90s. Edward's tone hardened as he shifted focus to Camilla's sharp ascent in the 1990s. He claimed Camilla had actively lobbied palace aides to diminish Diana's influence after the separation. He described how he discovered leaked memos, allegedly drafted by Camilla, urging a more controlled image of Charles and cautioning that Diana's independence was destabilizing. He shared an account of Camilla privately scoffing at Diana's charity work, labeling her activism too unpredictable for the strategy we need. Edward recalled Camilla saying in confidence, "It's time for a clean blueprint in public narrative." To Edward, these were not idle remarks. They were emotional ammunition directed at weakening Diana's position. And then came the most chilling part of all. Edward admitted he believed Camilla had motive to remove Diana from the public scene entirely. By sidelining Diana, Camilla could solidify her place as Charles's partner. And Edward now claimed there was evidence to support that motive. Charles's calculated ambitions. Edward turned his attention more sharply toward his brother Charles. He openly alleged that Charles feared Diana's influence would overshadow his plans with Camilla. He cited internal emails, later leaked, revealing plans to promote Camilla's image under the guise of royal duty. Diana had reportedly told Edward she'd overheard Charles quietly telling aides she had become impossible to control. Edward now suggested Charles might have silently agreed to more drastic measures to protect his institution. Still, Edward stressed this wasn't bare accusation. It was suspicion based on what he could no longer ignore. He remembered Diana's fear that she was being forgotten, only to be relabeled, polished, and hidden out of the way. But what if her disappearance had been orchestrated? The question weighed heavily as Edward invoked the chilling notion that Charles may have sanctioned a hidden strategy to secure his future. Security lapses on that fateful night. Edward's voice trembled again as he described glaring security failures in Paris. "One night, they left my sister vulnerable," he declared. He disclosed that logs revealed the Royal Protection Service had been unusually understaffed, and critical equipment checks on Diana's vehicle were suddenly cancelled. What followed struck even harder. The driver, Henri Paul, was abruptly switched by a palace aide, an action Edward described as too planned to be coincidental. Even more frighteningly, French police records later showed that CCTV footage from the Pont de l'Alma tunnel was unavailable, despite cameras being in working order just hours before. Edward insisted these were not absurd coincidences, they were coordinated lapses. Someone had to make these choices, and when safety systems failed, when protections evaporated, it was no longer just a failure. It felt like opportunity for malice. He left the crowd with one thought resonating in the chill Paris air. They did more than allow danger. They engineered it. Forensic anomalies and crash evidence. Prince Edward's tone darkened as he unraveled what he called the mechanical betrayal of Diana's final night. French investigators, he said, flagged something that was never supposed to be seen by the public. Strange wear on the brake system. Not from age or use, but something more targeted. It looked like tampering. The reports were downplayed, wrapped in jargon, and buried under layers of bureaucracy. He went further, describing tire skid marks that didn't match high-speed evasion. They were too clean, too symmetrical, suggesting not panic, but premeditation. Then there was the mysterious shard of concrete under one tire, a fragment that didn't match the road surface. It was, according to experts Edward had consulted, deliberately placed or left behind after a staged event. Seatbelt footage was missing. Dashcam angles had mysteriously failed. Surveillance from the tunnel blacked out or malfunctioning at the exact time of the crash. The official line? Technical error. But Edward didn't buy it. He believed someone made sure there would be no visual trail. Every shred of evidence screamed orchestration. But it was the silence afterward, the refusal to question the anomalies, that screamed complicity. Edward didn't ask the nation to believe in conspiracy. He asked them to believe in math, mechanics, and motive. Buried testimonies in the palace. Edward grew still as he recalled the whispers, the voices no one wanted to hear. After Diana's death, the palace had become unnervingly quiet. But before that silence, there were echoes. Aides had approached Edward in confidence, unnerved by internal discussions that branded Diana a destabilizing force. One admitted Camilla had privately questioned Diana's presence, asking, "How long can this go on before she ruins him?" The most haunting moment came from a junior press officer who confessed to Edward he had attended a meeting where Diana's name was spoken with frustration. Not sorrow, not compassion, frustration. She was a narrative they couldn't control, a spotlight they couldn't redirect. Edward claimed that once the crash happened, communications hardened, internal memos were restricted, talking points were circulated. Stick to Henri Paul, mention the paparazzi, avoid speculation. It was as if grief was being scripted. He remembered how one longtime staffer said it best: "The firm doesn't mourn, it moves." And that movement, Edward argued, was aimed at rewriting a tragedy into a technical footnote. One where no one had to answer, because no one was allowed to ask. International cover-up. Prince Edward's expression turned cold and steady as he delivered what he called the most chilling truth behind Princess Diana's death. Not the crash itself, but what happened after. The silence, the cooperation, the calculated control of an international tragedy. "This wasn't just a royal cover-up," Edward said firmly. "It was a wall of silence built across borders, and everyone who mattered helped lay the bricks." Within hours of the crash, Edward claimed, British and French officials weren't focused on facts or justice. They were drafting statements, rehearsing a message. And it wasn't just coincidence that the world heard the same words on every major news outlet: tragic accident, paparazzi pressure, driver intoxication. These weren't observations, they were talking points. Edward described seeing urgent diplomatic cables exchanged between London and Paris. The goal wasn't truth, it was damage control. According to him, the warnings were clear. If the media or investigators probed too deeply, public trust in both governments could collapse. They weren't protecting Diana, Edward stated, his voice tight. They were protecting the system. But even more disturbing were the actions taken behind the scenes. Edward said British intelligence actively monitored foreign journalists who questioned the official story. Reporters who uncovered conflicting witness statements or mysterious footage were sidelined, silenced, or vanished from their beats altogether. He recounted the story of a French journalist who had obtained footage from a traffic camera near the tunnel, footage that contradicted the official timeline. The footage was never aired, and that journalist, Edward revealed, disappeared from royal reporting and never returned. This wasn't just about hiding one night in a tunnel, Edward said, his voice low but firm. It was about hiding a machine of control, across governments, across borders, across truth itself. Edward made it clear. The cover-up was not isolated. It was global. It was intentional. And it was far bigger than anyone dared to admit. When power is protected by silence, he concluded, truth becomes dangerous. And now, the danger is being exposed. This wasn't just about Diana anymore. This was about the world's willingness to look away. And what happens when someone finally refuses? William and Harry's silent discomfort. Edward's tone shifted when he turned the spotlight onto William and Harry. The sons left motherless, thrust into the spotlight while still boys. His voice softened, but the pain beneath it sharpened. What haunted me most, Edward admitted, was watching them grieve behind a mask, pain that was never allowed to speak. He remembered a quiet evening at Balmoral, a few months after Diana's funeral. William, then barely holding it together, sat beside Edward in the drawing room. The television had just shown another royal segment brushing past the tragedy. William, almost in a whisper, said, "She was our mother, but to them, She was just a headline. Edward never forgot the way those words hung in the air, grief wrapped in resignation. William, he explained, had always worn his sorrow like armor. He bore the weight of duty, even when it threatened to crush him. But beneath that calm exterior, Edward saw a man quietly at war with the institution that failed to protect the woman he loved most. He said William wrestled with a hard truth: loyalty to the crown versus loyalty to his mother's memory. Harry, though, was different. He didn't hide behind duty. Edward described him as a fire burning under a lid. There were moments, Edward recalled, when Harry's voice would shake, not from emotion, but rage. Harry had questions, and not the kind the palace wanted to answer. "He came to me once," Edward said, "after an argument with Charles. He looked me in the eye and asked, did they know she was in danger? Did they do nothing?" Charles, according to Edward, didn't answer. And that silence, Edward said heavily, was all the answer Harry needed. This, Edward emphasized, wasn't some rebellious outburst. It was a reckoning, a family pulling at threads that had been tangled for decades. He believed both brothers had always known more than they ever let on. They didn't speak about it publicly, but in quiet glances, unfinished sentences, and the gravity of their presence, Edward saw the truth. "They never said it out loud," he confessed, "but I felt it in every look, every pause, every clenched jaw. They wanted justice, and they were tired of waiting." To Edward, this was no longer just about revelations or confessions. It was about liberating two sons from a legacy of silence. And now that the truth had cracked open the surface, he believed both William and Harry stood at the edge of something irreversible. Not war, but awakening. Camilla's unwanted ascent. When Edward turned his focus to Camilla, the room's temperature seemed to drop. His tone wasn't explosive. It was cold, measured, and sharp, like the tip of a blade that had been waiting decades to strike. This wasn't emotional reckoning. It was deliberate dissection. He didn't call her guilty. He didn't need to. The implication was in every carefully chosen word. "Within months of Diana's death," Edward began, his voice steady, "Camilla went from hidden mistress to future queen. That isn't healing, it's strategy." He described what he had seen behind closed doors, how royal aides began rebranding Camilla within weeks. Not years, not with time, but immediately. Media partners were given early access. Draft statements were prepared in advance. Even. The photographs that reintroduced Camilla to the public were filtered through layers of palace polish. Her rise, Edward said with grim certainty, wasn't a natural shift. It was a coronation without the crown. He cited internal palace memos from the late 90s, files he had read himself, suggesting a transition plan already in motion before Diana's death. Camilla's image was a project, and Diana's absence cleared the path. One line stayed with him. A young aide, overwhelmed by the speed of change, had whispered, "It's like Diana never existed." Edward paused. That sentence, he confessed, still kept him up at night. He recalled a dinner, not long after the funeral. The family was quiet, subdued. Grief still hung in the air. And then, casually, Camilla was heard saying, "The world is finally ready to turn the page." To Edward, that moment didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like conquest. Still, Edward resisted sweeping accusations. "I don't know if she orchestrated anything," he admitted, "but I know she benefited. And I know the silence that followed made it easier." And then, with the full weight of decades, betrayal, and buried truth behind his eyes, Edward looked directly into the camera. He said the words that echoed through every palace hallway, news report, and public heart. If Diana's death created a vacancy, someone filled it far too fast. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning. Because what Edward was really asking wasn't if Camilla took advantage of Diana's death. It was how many others helped her do it. Charles is breaking silence as Edward's bombshell revelations washed over headlines and news channels. The royal household was forced into an uneasy confrontation with a truth long buried. Prince Charles, a figure so often composed and controlled, now stood visibly unsettled. Edward painted a vivid scene, a hastily arranged meeting at Balmoral, summoned with all the urgency of a crisis response. The estate, once a symbol of regal stability, now hummed with tension. Charles entered the room not with his usual measured stride, but with the weight of decades on his shoulders. His composure seemed to crack, and the privilege of his calm facade was gone. Edward relayed Charles's trembling words as he spoke to his family. "We must close this chapter, or it will destroy everything we've built." There was no sweeping denial, no steadfast refusal, just a plea that had the unmistakable tone of desperation. Edward said it wasn't a sign of innocence. It was fear. Fear that the walls the monarchy had built over centuries were crumbling now. Under pressure from his sons and Edward himself, Charles didn't offer clarity. He avoided the questions and stuck to ready-made phrases such as, "A tragic time for us all," and "Let's focus on unity, not blame." Edward framed this silence not as dignity maintained, but as something far more disturbing. A man consciously protecting a fragile legacy. In the silent aftermath of that meeting, aides whispered around Balmoral that Charles seemed lost, unsteady in the corridors, his eyes distant. His usual aura of purpose had dissipated. Edward was left with no doubt. Charles's calm exterior had cracked under the pressure of the storm he had helped create. This shift in Charles was not merely personal, it was institutional. A king bound to his role, now overwhelmed by the tidal wave of accusations. The public was watching closely. People who once revered the monarch were now asking themselves if the throne could survive this internal fracture. The crisis wasn't just about his reputation. It was about whether the monarchy itself could now persist in a world demanding openness and accountability. In that moment, Edward realized the palace had changed irrevocably. Charles was trapped between the weight of silence and the demands of a world that refused to forget Diana. And whether he would rise with renewed purpose or crumble beneath the pressure remained the question that hung over the institution's future. This wasn't just a private family crisis. This was the beginning of a constitutional reckoning. Public outrage and institutional fallout. Prince Edward watched as his revelation triggered a global tremor. Across cities in the UK and around the world, from London's Trafalgar Square to community centres in Sydney, people gathered under shared grief and anger. Justice for Diana, truth, not tradition, and let the records speak became chants for the crowd. For the first time in decades, the once untouchable monarchy appeared fragile, its image cracking under intense scrutiny. Opinion polls pivoted almost overnight, with support plummeting 10 to 15 points within days. Conversations erupted in cafes, living rooms, and office break rooms. Even lifelong royalists paused and asked, was our trust misplaced? Families debated whether the crown had whispered half-truths for far too long. Simultaneously, media powerhouses went into overdrive. Journalists revisited French police logs, scrutinized diplomatic cables, and combed through years of palace communication. all searching for the tiniest thread that would confirm Edward's claims. New exposés and investigative programs emerged like wildfire. Filmmakers and researchers dug into sealed archives. Former staffers came forward, and an online petition wired for a public inquiry with full subpoena power surged past 1 million signatures. Inside the palace, panic took hold. Lawyers mobilized with lightning speed, drafting carefully worded denials and narrative corrections. Press chiefs shifted into containment mode, training spokespeople to paint Edward as misguided, rambling at long last. Rumors were strategically planted about sibling rivalries and fraternal envy. Yet each narrative was drowned in a tide of public empathy for Diana's children, now seen as champions of truth. Southbank remembers sad-eyed children laying tribute flowers. The tone shifted. This wasn't just celebrity gossip. It was a moral reckoning. The monarchy was no longer just a symbol of tradition. It was a guardian of truth, or possibly its adversary. Edward looked at the shifting institution around him. He didn't see the walls moving closer. Instead, he watched them crumble from within. He hadn't just leveled accusations, he had shattered the illusion. And once broken, illusions don't easily mend. From this moment on, transparency wasn't a choice. It was the cost of survival. The monarchy stood at a crossroads: retreat into old protections, or evolve under the relentless gaze of history. Edward's words had done more than echo. They had awakened a new standard of accountability. Because now, the question wasn't if transparency would come. It was how badly history would demand it. Cliffhanger. The final order. Edward sensed he had reached a crossroads. He stepped forward in a televised interview holding a sealed envelope. A single piece of paper he described as the final order from the night of Diana's crash. It carried fonts, signatures, and timelines too precise to ignore. He didn't say who signed it, only that the truth is only a signature away. He confirmed that Camilla was preparing a televised address. Within the palace, he heard panic, yet also defiance. He expected denial. "She will deny everything," he told reporters, but denial alone wouldn't silence him. Behind the scenes, staffers revealed Charles was considering stepping back. William and Harry had spoken of supporting a full, formal family-led inquiry, less about vengeance and more about truth. Edward hinted that if that happened, sealed files would be opened and documents laid bare. Then he paused and looked directly into the camera. One line, one order. That's all it takes to bring them all down. The weight of those words held the breath of a nation. The palace was bracing. The public was waiting. The truth stood on a knife's edge, and one final disclosure could shatter the old world. And now, the world holds its breath for the next move. As the palace scrambles and public pressure rises, one truth remains. Edward has spoken, and the world is listening. With each word, the myth unravels, and Diana's shadow grows louder. The monarchy stands at a crossroads. Will it silence him, or finally face the truth it buried?